Good evening and welcome to the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice of the Jacksonville Urban League's Racial Healing and Reconciliation monthly conversation. I am Jocelyn Turner. I happen to be a volunteer and the president of the Jacksonville Urban League Guild. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. We're going to have a great discussion from a very distinguished speaker, and he is Dr. Douglas Massey. He is a professor emeritus with Princeton University. Dr. Massey, you were there for 20 years. OMG, I can only imagine all of the wisdom that you and knowledge that you imparted with your students. Welcome and thank you for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing fine, but I can't get rid of the recording message on my machine.
Oh my goodness, if you just click OK, I think it should go away.
Yeah, I can't find I made a mistake and I have a white background and a white pointer and I can't find my pointer.
Oh no. Well, if it's not annoying to you, it won't show up anywhere else. So I can't see anything but your
Oh,
face, if that's okay with you. But I guess if you're gonna have your presentation,
I found it. I
you
found
found
it.
it.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
there we go.
Fantastic. Well, we have some more folks joining us this evening, and I think we're going to have, I know we're going to have a great discussion. And Dr. Massey, I did my homework. You have a very interesting background. I read some of I looked you up and saw some of the articles or journals that you've written. And, I'm impressed, but I have to ask you a question before you get started in your presentation. How did you get started in this space addressing a topic, particularly when it comes to racial discrimination in America?
Well, I grew up in the 60s, and civil rights movement was ongoing through my teenage years and my young adulthood. And I lived in Olympia, Washington, which is the state capital of Washington. And many years later, I learned that it was a sundown town. It had city regulations saying all Black people had to be out of the city by the sundown.
Hmm.
And I watched the civil rights era unfold on television. And in my senior year in high school, my civics teacher had our class read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that really changed the way I looked at things. And I began to understand the degree to which race was fundamental cleavage in American life. And I've never really given up on studying it. I did my PhD dissertation in 1978 studying patterns of segregation for Blacks and Latinos. And I've been working on the subject ever since. So, yeah, I grew up in a town, pretty much all white town. The first Black person to move into Olympia, Washington was when I was in junior high school.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of background that I come from. And I've devoted my life to understanding how that sort of thing happens, how whites can be so isolated from the rest of the country.
Wow, thank you. Well, thank you for getting in this space because it is a very important topic for us to talk about, and it is our history. You just shared some very interesting history from your upbringing. So, thank you for doing that. We are, and I failed to mention that I am pinch hitting for Dennis Stone tonight, the director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice with the Jacksonville Urban League. So I am pleased that Dennis asked me to fill in for him tonight. Dr. Massey, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And we are broadcasting live on Facebook. So, and then there are some folks who are in this space with us. So, thank you so much as you begin your discussion on racial discrimination in 21st century America, from discriminatory exclusion to predatory inclusion. Take it away, Dr. Massey.
Well, thank you. What I'm going to talk about is the evolution of systemic racism in the United States. And systemic racism is probably not an unfamiliar concept to people in the Urban League, but it really goes way back to the beginning of the United States. And you can divide it up, American history, into different eras in which race was made through public policies in the country, even before it was a country. So the first Africans arrived on the shores of the U.S. in 1619, and we start getting court records dealing with issues of race. whether a black person could testify in a court against a white person, and so on. And a series of judicial decisions were issued between 1619 and 1661, which basically laid out the principles of white superiority and black inferiority. Judicial court decisions are haphazard. They accumulate. They don't really compose a body of law. So the legislatures took over in 1662, began to legislate race. They're spelling out what it meant to be black, what it meant to be white, what it meant to be enslaved, what it meant to be freed, and how those different groups could interact with one another. And by 1702, 1703, Virginia had enacted a full body of law known as the slave codes, which spelled out the parameters of slavery and black servitude. And that was spread throughout the southern states and even into the northern states. Then, of course, the constitutional eras from 1789 to 1862, and the 84 clauses in the Constitution, 6 were directly concerned with slaves and their servants, and 5 more had implications for slavery that are explicitly debated. And so we have a country that was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, that nonetheless allowed slavery to exist, not only to exist, but to be inscribed in the Constitution, in the social structure of the United States, into the political structure of the United States, in such a way that not only would slavery continue, but it would be very difficult ever to overturn through constitutional means, through constitutional processes. And of course, in the end, slavery didn't get overturned through normal constitutional processes. The amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, were passed while after the Civil War, with the Union troops occupying the South. And it was unusual. It really took a civil war to get rid of slavery. And then there was the Reconstruction period from 1863 to 1876, when there was rapid movement forward for black freedoms all over the country. But that came to an end in 1876 in a disputed election when Rutherford B. Hayes reached an agreement with the Southerners that if they allowed him to become president, he would withdraw Union troops from the South, and that he became a one-term president and withdrew the troops from the South, and that began the formation of the legal body of informal and formal practices that constituted white supremacy in the South, with social segregation under the Jim Crow system in the South and spatial segregation outside the South. So social segregation was segregating all the facilities, any place anybody could go. Spatial segregation outside the South was on the neighborhood basis. And this was all baked into American law and practice and social structure. In the Civil Rights era of 1954 to 1977, major pieces of civil rights legislation were passed. 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision started it all off, and it ends in 1977 with the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, which outlaws redlining and it was the last major piece of civil rights legislation passed. And then we enter a period I call colorblind racism from 1978 to the present, where race is officially outlawed, racial discrimination is officially outlawed, but practices nonetheless continue, and the structures of racial oppression persist. The turning point in really racial construction in the United States occurs around 1900, beginning of the Great Black Migration out of the South and into cities throughout the North and the West. It was entailed the massive migration of Black Americans out of the South and the massive migration of Black Americans from rural areas into cities. So you see the blue line is the percent living in the South, and it was 90% basically in 1900, and by 1970 it's down to 52%. So half of Black America now lives outside the South. And this was not simply a regional movement, it was a movement from rural to urban areas. As you can see, the percentage of Blacks living in rural areas falls steadily to reach very small percentages of around 5% today. So the segregation, the spatial segregation of African Americans and what came to be known as the Black Ghetto begins to take form after 1900 is because of the Black migration out of the South and into cities. And Black populations in urban America began to grow, and began to grow in the North, particularly in the industrializing cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And arrival of African Americans in cities was met with tremendous hostility in a way that separated them from other arrivals coming from Europe at the time. Italians, Poles, Jews were arriving at the same time and did experience their own kinds of prejudice and discrimination, nothing compared to what African Americans would experience when they showed up in cities. And various methods and techniques were used to promote segregation. Uh, Always behind the system of segregation is the threat of racial violence. Racial violence was fairly open from 1900 to 1920, and it consisted of communal violence, that is, race riots, not the race riots we remember from the 60s, but race riots where whites would systematically attack African Americans who dared to cross the residential color line and attempt to live in what they considered to be a white area. And this peaked during the late teens and culminated in 1919 with the Great Chicago Race Riot, where hundreds of people were killed. Uh, and the race riots surged through the United States in 1917, 18, 19, and convinced the real estate industry that they needed to do something to stop the violence and protect property. And so from 1920 to 1940, uh, violence didn't disappear, but when it was more targeted and targeted specific home seekers who were crossing the color line. And the levels of violence did, in fact, decrease because they began to use other mechanisms to promote segregation. The first mechanism they tried to use was basically an apartheid system where by law they would set aside black and white neighborhoods. And this was spreading throughout the country until 1917, when, in the Buchanan v. Warley decision of the Supreme Court, declared that these laws were unconstitutional, not because they discriminated against African Americans, but because they prevented white property owners from disposing of their property as they saw fit. So you couldn't pass neighborhood acts, Group Areas Act like South Africa. So then they turned to other mechanisms. Deed restrictions were the first, where deeds would be amended with a codicil saying that it prohibited rental or sale of property to blacks. This was able to stop black property ownership in white areas on a lot by lot basis, but it wasn't very systematic. So the homeowners organizations began to organize collectively and act collectively whenever they felt threatened by black immigrants in their neighborhoods. They pressured or bribed black settlers to leave. And of course, if black settlers didn't leave, then violence would transpire and they'd be forced out. In beginning in the 1920s, the real estate industry itself took hold. And they developed a new technique known as restrictive covenants, which are basically contracts that covered a neighborhood in which homeowners agreed not to rent or sell to blacks. When a majority of homeowners or property owners in a covered area had signed the contract, then it became binding, and people who violated the contract would be taken to civil court and prohibited. The leader in this was the Chicago Real Estate Board, which in 1927 designed and prepared a model covenant, that is, a model that could be adapted and used all over the country. And this was adopted by the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and they used it and promoted it all over the United States. So what began as a promoting segregation in Chicago really became a national phenomenon in the 1920s. And the National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics was amended to state that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. So that was built into the Code of Ethics of the entire real estate industry. So basically, segregation and discrimination were mandated by the professional organizations, and so under private auspices, segregation will move forward. A key figure in this was a guy named Frederick M. Babcock, who wrote The Valuation of Real Estate, which became the Bible for the real estate industry. And this is a direct quote from his book, The Valuation of Real Estate. There's one difference in people, namely race, which can result in very rapid decline. Usually such declines can be partially avoided by segregation, and this device has always been in common use in the South, where white and Negro populations have been separate. And you can see, these are images from the time, 60th Street, and this is in Philadelphia, below Catherine Street. It's covered by restrictive covenants. And And then there's the deed restrictions up in the top right, and then you see more basic language from covenants and deed restrictions that prohibited people of African origin from moving into white neighborhoods. And you can see it had an effect. Back in 1890, levels of segregation were quite varied and averaged about 45.4 on a 0 to 100 scale, where 0 means blacks and whites are evenly distributed across neighborhoods. 100 means that blacks and whites don't share any neighborhoods in common. So you can see that it did have an effect, raising average segregation across cities steadily up to a value of 70.7, which is a very high level of segregation. And you can see they were especially prominent in northern cities, particularly the industrializing cities in the Northeast and Midwest. And this is ward level segregation in selected southern cities. As you can see, on average, segregation levels were lower in the southern cities. And that's because Jim Crow mandated social segregation, and blacks and whites often interacted in close terms and often lived together in close terms, with wide streets with white mansions in the front and then alleys in the back where the black servant class lived. And they relied on the social distinctions between blacks and whites to keep the races separate and keep racial peace. So the South was not as segregated as the North initially. Next major change comes in with the New Deal in the 1930s. This is in the 1930s, after the Great Depression hit in 1929, and Roosevelt was elected in 1932, and he announced his New Deal. The federal government became very involved, deeply involved in the political economy of the United States through regulation and through and various pieces of law that sought to redistribute the balance of power between labor and capital. And their initial concern was getting out of the recession. And when Roosevelt assumed office in 1933, middle-class white people were losing their homes to through forced foreclosure. And so he developed the Homeowners Loan Corporation. His administration developed the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was basically designed to save people whose houses were in danger of being foreclosed. And basically, it created long-term mortgages of 30 years and low down payments and federal guarantees for 90% of the value of the loan, provided the loan met certain criteria that the federal government specified. It had to be a long-term amortization of 30 years, low down payment, and it had to meet certain standards for building and so on. But it also had to have neighborhood inspection, neighborhood validation. And they used these things called residential security maps, which color-coded the neighborhoods. And neighborhoods were color-coded green, yellow, or red. And red meant that the neighborhoods are ineligible for federally funded mortgages, federally backed mortgages. This didn't make much of a difference because there weren't that many homes being foreclosed in the general scheme of things. This changed with the Housing Acts of 1934 and 37, which created and expanded the FHA loan program. And then as we got into the Second World War and this Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill, created a VA loan program modeled on the FHA program. And then Housing Acts of 1949, 54, and 56 expanded funds for federal lending, authorized urban renewal and slum clearance, provided funds for public housing, established a one-for-one principle for the building of public housing. So if you tear down a slum with 10 houses, you had to provide some place for people to go. And so for every house unit you tear down, you had to provide one. And that's where the public housing came in. Guess who ended up being the key person in the Federal Housing Administration? Frederick M. Babcock. He was the director of the newly established underwriting division of the Federal Housing Administration, and he was chief of the underwriting section until it was reorganized into a division. And he has been with he was with the Federal Housing Authority since 1934. And this is a direct quote from a news release from the FHA. Under his direction, the Babcock system of appraisal was established and has now become accepted as a standard generally throughout the United States. So basically, he introduced the same principles that he had created for the private real estate industry into federal regulations and federal policy. So discrimination was baked um, into American life for decades because of this. The FHA underwriting manual of 1938, which he championed and wrote most of. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes, and recommended the use of restrictive covenants and residential security maps. This is a residential security map of Baltimore. So you can see inner Baltimore is all color coded in red. It's kind of purple on my screen, but on the original maps it's red. And then it's yellow, and then it's green or blue. And those are all eligible. So basically, inner city Baltimore was deprived of capital and credit, both in the private and public sector. Banks wouldn't lend there. Real estate agents wouldn't sell there. Wouldn't sell there. And as African Americans moved into the city and neighborhoods turned black, they would be cut off from capital and credit and begin to go downhill. So the disintegration of the inner city was built into public policy and private practice by the 1930s. And this is levels of segregation in northern cities from 1940 to 1970. And this is census tract level, which is more like a neighborhood. And you can see that the ghetto became a structural feature of American life with very, very high levels of segregation in principal cities throughout the United States. And although southern cities still were a little bit lower, they too began to move into very high levels of segregation as this unfolded. Then came the Civil Rights era. As I said, began in 1954. Civil Rights Act of 1957 was basically an anti-lynching act, which didn't do much. It basically was a vehicle for Lyndon Johnson to show how he could control the Senate and be the first person to get a piece of civil rights legislation through the Senate since Reconstruction, as a kind of prelude to his activities when he became president. And then Kennedy was elected in 1961 and signed an executive order banning discrimination against on the basis of race in federally funded projects. Then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated, and he became a martyr. And Lyndon Johnson assumed office and said, nothing finer no finer tribute to the dead president could be had except more than his passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So in early 1964, the Civil Rights Act did pass with breaking a Southern filibuster, outlawing discrimination in housing and accommodations, accommodations and services, and school, and putting some teeth into school desegregation. Followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave the federal government the power to go in and force states and localities to abide by the Constitution. Loving v. Virginia was the aptly titled Supreme Court decision that ended restrictions on interracial marriage. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 finally banned discrimination in housing. And it wasn't until 1974 that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act banned discrimination in lending. And it wasn't until 1977, when I was in graduate school, that Community Reinvestment Act was passed to prohibit redlining, the use of color coding of neighborhoods, which had gone on since the Depression, since the 1930s. And you can see that it's had an effect. This is the average trend in segregation for Black Americans in the 50 largest metropolitan areas. And you can see it's going steadily down, although at a slightly decelerating pace. But it's very uneven. So this is the average, but these are the 10 most segregated cities in the United States. You can see that their segregation is persisting at extremely high levels, and it would take decades to go down to low levels if the current pace continues. So in the 1970s, we began to enter a new era where levels of segregation are starting to trickle to slowly decline and go downward. It's officially illegal to discriminate on the basis of race and lending, and illegal to use color-coded maps and redlining, and discrimination in virtually all markets has been outlawed. what really changed the situation in the 1980s and 1990s was the advent of a new mortgage new mortgage plan, a new mortgage mechanism, the advent of mortgage-backed securities, which created a huge demand for mortgages on the part of the financial industry. So the Financial Services Moderation Act, signed into law by President Clinton, allowed the unlimited in-house creation of mortgage-backed securities as investment instruments. So firms like Morgan, House of Morgan, and Goldman Sachs were free to make use of mortgages in their securities without constraint. And so the number of mortgages was not constrained by the capital that a bank had on hand to lend. In the old days, you go to a bank and say, "I would like a loan," and they would look at, check out your credit, and if you qualified, you would get a loan. And then you'd pay the bank back with monthly payments, and the bank would take those payments and use it to reduce your obligation on the loan and collect their interest. And banks could only lend based on how much capital they had on hand. But when mortgage-backed securities come into existence, then the number of mortgages is only limited by what the market for mortgage-backed securities could bear. And the binding constraint becomes the number of mortgages that can be generated, and the creditworthiness of borrowers is no longer seen as an issue. And subprime loans actually carry higher interest rates and can be bundled with conventional loans to, in theory at least, control risk. So this created a hugely profitable cycle that really took hold in the 1980s and early 2000s, where banks ceased to be in the mortgage business. They became mortgage brokers rather than mortgage issuers. One of the biggest mortgage lender in the United States was Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo shifted from lending to generating. It would send out brokers to generate loans, and they'd go out and try to sell mortgages to people, and then the firms would take the mortgages that were sold, and then they divide them into what are called risk tranches, risk segments. So they put bundle them together to back a mortgage security, and then repackage loans from different tranches into bonds that then were sold to investors. And the rating agencies gave the bonds AAA rating because they believed the risk was controlled by diversification of risk. And all these actors made money while assuming no risk. So the brokers would go out and sell mortgages to people, and then originate mortgages to people, and then sell them to the financial securities firms. Financial securities firms would put together bonds that were backed by mortgages, and then the rating agencies who were paid by the securities firm would rate them with AAA rating so that they would stay in good graces with the securities firm. And then the bonds would go out into the market and be sold. And smart investors, managed risks through what were called credit default swaps, which is basically an insurance policy. So Morgan Stanley would be basically issuing risky bonds, mortgage-backed security bonds, and they knew they were risky, so they would take out an insurance policy that would pay them for the value of the mortgage if it defaulted. But they were on the inside. Most bondholders didn't know about this practice. So this set off an intense search for borrowers. And in this context, formerly excluded clients became extremely attractive. The racial segregation of poor minorities created a natural market for subprime lending. And geographic concentrations of financially unsophisticated and historically underserved minority homeowners became a prime target for subprime lending by unscrupulous brokers. Segregation was directly linked to racially targeted subprime lending. So instead of excluding people, saying a redlined area, you couldn't issue mortgages in a redlined area, they would target segregated Black neighborhoods for selling them high risk, high cost mortgages that could be sold on the market and to create financial instruments. So this led to a racially segmented mortgage market, where controlling for individual and neighborhood characteristics, the rate of subprime lending was significantly greater for Blacks and Hispanics. From 1993 to 2000, for example, the share of subprime mortgages in minority neighborhood went from 2 to 18%. Minorities were much more likely to receive unfavorable terms with prepayment penalties, high cost ratio to value ratios, large rate spreads. And this holds at all income levels. It doesn't, and even the most affluent segment of the Black population was not protected from this. In fact, they were targeted because they had built equity in homes. This is a graph showing the relationship between segregation on the x-axis, so you're moving from low segregation to high segregation on the x-axis, going from Salt Lake City with low segregation up to Milwaukee, Detroit with high segregation. And then the y-axis is the black-white difference in subprime lending, likelihood of subprime lending. So you see the higher the degree of segregation, the more likely blacks were to be steered into subprime loans there. And we estimated a complicated model, which I don't expect you to really understand, but just wanted to show you that the point is that the segregation of Black Americans was a powerful predictor of subprime lending. And we did a special technique that allowed us to determine whether this is a causal effect, and it is in fact a causal effect. So racial segregation was a direct cause of subprime lending or foreclosures. Then we took another turn. This is a paper I wrote with some of my graduate students to study how it played out in the city of Baltimore. As you saw from that map earlier, it was redlined up to the hilt. So we got all the loans that were issued under the home issued in Baltimore County in the period from 2000 to 2008, and then we got loan level records covering different types of mortgage backs. So we collected all the data that was out there, and then we looked at 2,526 loans made to non-Hispanic blacks and non-Hispanic whites in Baltimore during 2000 to 2008. And then we looked at the likelihood of getting a subprime loan, the likelihood of getting a combined risk loan, that is a high risky kind of loan, monthly payment involved, and whether or not the mortgage ever entered foreclosure and whether foreclosure was achieved. And so this is, again, complicated models. And you see, moving from left to right, the top shows what the effect of is a borrower being black or a borrower living in a predominantly black tract is on the likelihood of the outcomes seen at the top. So column 1 here, you see that very significant, powerful effect of being black or being in a black tract on getting a high cost subprime loan. And then you start throwing in controls, everything in the middle panel between the two lines. Everything in there is all information directly seen by the loan officers. And then we even controlled for census tract characteristics as well. And even though when you throw in these controls, the racial effect stays to be very strong. So blacks are pushed into high cost subprime loans more than whites. And it's a very significant effect. And they pushed in, you can see the next panel over, high risk loans, high cost, high risk loans, same kind of pattern, where being black or living in a black neighborhood basically dramatically increases likelihood of getting a high risk loan. And then we went one step further and looked, okay, in addition to looking whether the borrower was black and lived in a black tract, we looked at the effect of having a high cost subprime loan or a combined risk loan on the likelihood of entering foreclosure. So blacks, just for being black, they have a high risk of entering into subprime, into foreclosure. But a big part of why that is because they were pushed into high cost, high risk loans, and that also dramatically increases the likelihood that they get foreclosed. So again, I'm sorry for all the numbers, but they tell a compelling story. I want to focus on the one in the first one that's highlighted in yellow. And basically what we did is what's called a counterfactual analysis. So we took the statistical models that we estimated, and we asked the question, what kind of treatment would blacks, what kind of loans would mortgage loans would blacks have gotten if they'd been treated in the same way as whites? And then we looked at the difference between the way they were treated and the way they were observed, the way they should have been treated and the way that they are actually treated. And you can see that look in the panel in the middle there, that they pay 6.4% more than whites for this if than if they had been treated like a white borrower. And if the borrower's income is over 50,000, middle class income back in the day, they're even more likely, 7.2%. And when mortgage meltdown happened after 2008, a lot of politicians blamed the Community Reinvestment Act for forcing banks to loan into unqualified people in Black and Latino neighborhoods. But you see, it's not the government-backed government programs. It's private label securitization loans. That's the private sector, and they're 11.3%. So the discrimination was rampant in the private sector, and then we carry the analysis through further to show how it affects the likelihood of entering foreclosure. And you can see that over here on the right-hand side, that they paid because of the way they were treated, the discriminatory way they were given high cost, high risk loans. $46,000 of their housing was at stake, and in the city of Baltimore, that accumulated to $3.5 million in total. And if the borrowers were richer, it was 43,000, and if the borrowers were mortgaged to a private sector firm, it was 44,000, and that accumulates up to around 2.4, 2.8, and $3.4 million sucked out of the Black community and potentially threatened in the Black community. And then the final step is, of course, for actual foreclosure. You see at the very last column on the yellow panel, by 2008, $2 million had left the Black community, 1.5 in general in Baltimore, because of subprime lending. So as a direct wealth transfer out of Black neighborhoods into pockets of white, mostly white bankers and people working in the financial industry. And we also did a qualitative analysis looking at what happened during the lending industry. You can't read this probably, but these are all the fair housing lending cases filed from 1994 to 2014, alleging predatory discriminatory lending. 4 cases went to trial. Barclay v. Olympia Mortgage, which was small. The 2 big ones were Wells Fargo Bank versus City of Baltimore and Wells Fargo Bank versus City of Memphis. And these cases generated declarations, depositions, and other exhibits that provide a valuable window on the organizational context of the mortgage lending that occurred during the 2008 housing boom. Wells Fargo was the biggest subprime originator, as I said. And so we did a content analysis of all the deposition statements and testimonies, and did a random sample of 220 statements and subject them to content analysis. And data coding was done by 2 of my co-authors, and they each coded blindly from each other and colored whether the evidence was present or evidence not present or not applicable. And inter-rater reliability was 0.86, so they agreed with each other 86% of the time, so which means it's highly reliable. And this is what we found, that we found systematic evidence of institutional discrimination in more than 3/4 of the testimonies. And these are examples taken from testimony. These are verbatim transcripts. So evidence that it's structural discrimination built into the business model of Wells Fargo. Would your split be higher if the borrower paid a higher interest rate? Answer: if the company made a little more, I would make a little more. So there's an incentive for mortgage lending officers to push people towards higher cost, higher risk loans. The commission and referral system at Wells Fargo was set up in a way that made it profitable for a loan officer to refer a prime customer for a subprime loan, then make that loan directly to the customer. The trading desk set the bid terms and purchase terms for those loans. Trading desk decisions were not the workings of some lone rogue employees. Instead, it was essential to Morgan Stanley's business model to vest the trading desk with the ultimate power to decide which loans to buy, regardless of their quality, because doing so maximized the supply of loans to New Century Loans and the cash from those loans. And one person who was deposed, said, "I complained many times about what I thought were unethical or predatory loan practices that Wells Fargo was engaged in. Managers never took any action to respond to my concerns. In my office, we morbidly joked that we were riding the stagecoach to hell." And this gets at the essence of systemic discrimination. This person was very bothered by it, didn't want to do it, felt bad about it, but nonetheless went along because his or her job depended on it. So, and it was part of Wells Fargo's business model. So basically, people were pushed into discriminating even though they didn't want to, because it was built into the structure of the system. And there was also a lot of evidence of both individual and structural discrimination. The loan officers in the resource division referred to subprime loans in minorities communities as ghetto loans, and minority customers as those people who have bad credit and those people who don't pay their bills, and mud people. I believe that Wells Fargo did not promote me for two reasons. First, Wells Fargo management culture is white. This was a black loan officer. Second, Wells Fargo management knew I treated Wells Fargo customers well by offering them to refinance to prime and FHA loans when they qualified. Wells Fargo also targeted African Americans through special seminars called wealth building seminars. I remember preparing a wealth building seminar to be held in Greenbelt, Maryland, which is that's basically county outside of Washington, D.C. that's predominantly black. It was understood that the audience would be virtually all black. The point of this seminar was to get people to buy houses using Wells Fargo loans. The same seminar, the plan was to talk about the alternative lending. This was code language for subprime lending, but we're not allowed to use the word subprime. I was supposed to be a speaker at this seminar, but the emerging markets manager told me I was too white. That is, he was too light-skinned to appear before the audience. I was offended by these statements and complained to several ranking managers, but the company never took any action. Let's see here. Oh. Number 16, elderly African-American customers were thought to be particularly vulnerable and were frequently targeted for subprime loans with high interest rates. I remember one instance where an elderly African-American woman who was over 65 could not qualify for a subprime loan that a credit manager wanted to put her into. So the credit manager convinced her to transfer the property to her son so that some subprime loan could be made to him. In practice, where I worked with the Wells Fargo's office is where I worked, to target African Americans for subprime loans. It was generally assumed that African American customers were less sophisticated, less intelligent, could be manipulated more easily into a subprime loan with expensive terms than white customers. I heard employers joking with one another about the race of the customer, saying, "You know, that guy doesn't seem very smart." We did the analysis that showed discrimination in Baltimore, and we provided our analysis to a civil rights firm, and they filed suit in federal court. And Wells Fargo settled out of court for a $175 million fine, which is small justice compared to all the billions they made in the process. So basically, I've told a story about how segregation was created in the United States through institutionalized practices in the private sector, in the real estate industry, how the private real estate industry transferred those practices into the federal government itself and made it a nationwide federal program that persisted up until the civil rights era, and then even continued after the civil rights era surreptitiously, because open discrimination fell, but clandestine discrimination continued. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, the discrimination flipped from exclusion under redlining to predatory inclusion, targeting black neighborhoods, especially middle-class black neighborhoods, for predatory lending and wealth extraction. So that's the sad tale that I tell. When I go through the details about this, my students are often shocked that they don't understand the degree to which segregation was wired into the structure of the United States, and the degree to which it still has negative consequences moving forward. And is the main feature behind the huge gap in wealth between blacks and whites. Incomes have approached one another. The wealth gap between blacks and whites has not shrunk at all. In fact, it got worse over the course of the Great Recession because African Americans were targeted for predatory lending. And so even though incomes are getting somewhat closer, wealth disparities remain huge, and that has everything to do with the housing market and segregation, and first redlining and then predatory inclusion under mortgage-backed securities. So I'd be happy to answer your questions. And
Wow, Dr. Massey, that was amazing. And quite honestly, the thing that I think about is that the situations have changed, but people are still doing setting up institutional or structural racism practices in order to discriminate against Black and Brown people. In many communities, as you know, the housing market is changing. People can no longer afford to buy a home and, quite honestly, not even rent. And you see a lot of neighborhoods. I know in some neighborhoods in here in Northeast Florida that were predominantly African American, because African Americans are losing their homes because of the lending and the loans that they receive, and they're no longer able to afford it. They're losing their properties, and so then those investment firms are buying the properties, and now you're seeing the communities are now more, as someone just, thank you, Tammy, you see gentrification happening. And wow, all I can just say is wow. I would like to ask you if you would to explain a term that unfortunately many people don't hear, because in many communities, some of our elected officials have decided that it's not important to tell the history as you've outlined tonight. Explain to our audience, what is Jim Crow?
well, Jim Crow was a system that replaced slavery. And in the rural sector, it basically substituted sharecropping for predatory sharecropping for slavery, where people were kept in debt and forced to work for basically nothing, even though it wasn't a slavery, it was like slavery, and that persisted well into the 20th century. And then with the Great Black Migration out, it began to wither, but never really went away. And what ended it was really the mechanization of cotton harvesting rather than any good behavior on the part of anyone. And Jim Crow, of course, set up a legal structure that mandated separation between the races in all circumstances. So separate restrooms, separate places in the movie theaters, separate stores, separate facilities. And this was given constitutional approval in 1893 with the Plessy decision, which adopted the fig leaf that they were separate but equal. But if any cursory examination would show that the black facilities and the white facilities were never equal. Black facilities were always in much lower quality, and that persisted really until 1964. And I was 12 years old already, so I remember when this happened, and that was life in the South. And of course, as always, this whole system of Jim Crow was backed up by the threat of violence, and the threat of violence was violence was built into the social structure as well. So people have done analysis of the frequency of lynchings, and they find out whenever there's a decline in the price of cotton or a political or economic threat, lynchings go up. So it's not something that's random; it's something that's systematic. And that was the South, so yeah, that was the system of Jim Crow. The first effort to dismantle it was the '64 Act, then the Voting Rights Act '65, then the Fair Housing Act in '68, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in '74, and not until 1977 did redlining end. So it was a long, drawn out battle, and before Jim Crow ended, and then. And now they adopt these new mechanisms, as you've outlined, what you described as occurring. It's exactly what is happening. Financial firms are coming into neighborhoods where there was a lot of foreclosures, buying up the properties, turning them around and reselling them, and often putting them into new kinds of mortgage-backed securities or financial securities. So they're making money off of Black misfortune once again.
Thank you. Doug, Mr. Malone, I called you Doug. I don't know why I called you Doug. William Malone, did you have a question before we get to Tammy? I think you're about to say something.
No, I'm just trying to take it in.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tammy.
Well, first of all, Dr. Massey, thank you so much for speaking. I began to read your scholarship almost 20 years ago when I was working on my PhD.
Oh.
Yeah, and at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which you know is a highly segregated city.
It's the most segregated city in the United States now.
Yeah, and my parents married in 1962, and my dad was African American, and my mother is not. She's European American, and so she had to move into the inner city, but they married in 62. But again, it was in Wisconsin. So I appreciate your work. I appreciate your allyship. I wish that you could transfer it to other people, because I know we have a lot of allies, but it's like a serious time now, and I think people need to be more engaged in community. So again, I'm just thankful to be here. I love your presentation. I've been reading your scholarship for a long time. I know I quoted you in several articles. So just happy to be in your presence.
Even if it's virtual.
Even if it's virtual, exactly. Yes, sir. And just I do want to note though, I did a TED talk entitled The Social Implication of Race, and I'm biracial, and I traced it all the way back. And just basically in Virginia, where the slave, I think her name was Keys, she won her freedom because her father was white, and traced it all the way back and just looked at the dimmer, how the institutional concepts have changed, the names have, but not what's taking place. And
You know,
so, and just talked about it as a biracial person who grew up very much cloaked in white privilege in Milwaukee on the east side of town.
yeah, well, on my agenda for the future, I've retired, and so I look upon retirement as a permanent sabbatical for the rest of my life. And on my agenda is to write a history of systemic racism in the United States.
Yeah, because like as you noted, it began when the first slave ship got here. Like they put mechanisms in place.
Yep, and
Hmm.
you can see it in the court record.
Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Tammy, for your question. Do we have any other questions from our guests? And by the way, Dr. Massey, can you put the screen, take it off of speaker screen and put it so that we can see everyone? I'm having a hard time to see you all. Are there any other questions?
I don't know if I can control that.
Okay. And I don't know who else is the co-host, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of the other work that you've done. When I was looking up American Apartheid, and I looked up American Apartheid as segregation and discrimination experienced by African Americans in the United States, again, particularly in southern states. Other than what you've talked about, and looking at, I know some of the work, you've been retired now for a little while, but I know you are still current and active. I was looking up, the laws and social norms African Americans are denied. All sorts of things have been happening in regards to voting rights. I mean, the ridiculous things like you can't receive water from someone if you're standing in line, while if you've been in line for several hours, and criminal justice disparities, the fact that African Americans or people of color are disproportionately incarcerated or face longer sentences. In addition to the work that you explained, your work that you explained as far as housing discrimination, have you done any work or any articles or even speaking engagements on criminal justice discrimination or disparities?
No, but I've read a lot of books, and I included in my course, and I refer to it in my writings. Um, the the person who really opened that door up was a guy named Bruce Western, who used to teach at Princeton, but now he's at Columbia University, and he's really the guy who opened up the criminal justice system to study and show its racial disproportion, and his work was seminal, and other people have followed it. It's well documented. And Michelle Alexander has a book, The New Jim Crow, which really gives a good overview of how criminal justice was racialized beginning in the 1970s, to bring the full force of, yeah, there it is, bring the full force of the legal system to really bear on Black men, so, to the point where you're more likely to go to prison than college.
Right, right. And can you talk a little bit about employment discrimination?
Yeah, um, there's a there's a lot of evidence from audit studies where you it's a you get you set up a situation where you send a white applicant in and a black applicant in, and they're matched in all kinds of characteristics, and then you observe systematic differences between them. And these audit studies have been going on since the 70s and 80s, and they've accumulated now. And one of my former students, who's at Northwestern University, has done a meta-analysis that looks at all these different studies and sees what the big conclusions are from the various studies. And he says that he finds that there's very little change in levels of discrimination over time. The mechanisms have changed. I did one study that looked at housing segregation, looking at people who speak Black English vernacular versus more middle-class American English. And there's linguistic profiling going on. So if a person is identifiable as Black, they're much less likely to get a callback, much less likely to get access to an apartment. And of course, then more recently, with everything shifting to the internet, there's a number of famous studies showing employment discrimination against people with Black-sounding names, and those are big studies, lots of cases, because it's the internet's big data, and you can download resumes from monster.com, and then just match them and just change the names, and see what happens, and you observe systematic differences in likelihood of getting employment. And one of my former colleagues, Diva Pager, who unfortunately passed away, she did a study looking at how the criminal justice system, having a criminal justice record, affected employment odds. And she found that a white criminal was more likely to get a call back than a Black non-criminal without a criminal record. And black with a criminal record was almost impossible to get a foot in the door. So there's a lot of work going on studying discrimination. It hasn't gone away. It's still there. It's more subtle and less open, but nonetheless quite effective.
So you mentioned, thank you. You mentioned the Financial Services and Moderation Act that Bill Clinton enacted during his tenure or during his presidency. Fast forward to 2023. Has our current president or former president enacted any laws that address structural or institutional racism in America?
Not to the extent that I would like, but they don't listen to me. There's a lot of these practices are resurfacing again. A new colleague on the faculty at Princeton named John Robertson III. He's studying financialization of racism and how the financial industry, the loan industry, the payday loan industry, car loan industry, that's being racialized in the same way that the mortgage-backed securities industries were being racialized. And there's very little effort on the part of the Civil Rights Enforcement Division and the Department of Justice to really track these things. Of course, it was prohibited during the Bush administration and during the Trump administration. Obama did remarkably little to change this. I was a big supporter of Obama, and he wasn't a bad president, but I was disappointed that he didn't get more done. Of course, he was immediately 6 of his 8 years he was blocked by losing control of both houses of Congress. He had a 2-year window to accomplish things, and basically the only thing he accomplished was getting the Affordable Care Act passed, which is not trivial, but there wasn't enough being done. And when the Republicans get in charge, they don't even want to face up to the fact. And I mean, I probably get arrested in Florida for giving this talk in a public school.
Yes, you will. You certainly will. And it's so interesting, as you mentioned, the Affordable Care Act, the administrations have, I mean, not administrations, our elected officials in Congress have done everything they can to try to dismantle that system, anything, I guess, the Black president put in place. So we're nearing the end of our hour. An amazing presentation. Your knowledge, I know when you officially retired from Princeton University, the students and the faculty there, I'm sure, miss you, but fortunately you are still, once connected, you're always connected, and in your status as a professor emeritus. Thank you so much for imparting your your knowledge. And you're right, if you were in Florida, you would be arrested. But the importance of these monthly conversations is to educate folk and let them know that through the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League, we are here to make sure that you understand and what's going on, and know that as a citizen in our country, you have the right and the opportunity to advocate and do your homework. Dr. Massey referenced so many articles. If you miss them, I encourage you. The presentation will be made available so that you can go back through it and share it. Don't just keep it to yourself. Please share and tune in next month as we continue the discussion on racial healing and reconciliation. Thank you again, Dr. Massey. Thank you to our audience, and have a good evening.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.